In every Western city, you expect streets built for people, layers of history on every corner, and public spaces that invite you in. Moscow is different by design. In 1935, Soviet leaders didn't just redraw the map, they wiped out 400 churches, dynamited the largest cathedral, and imposed a blueprint that turned the city into a monument to state power. This radical transformation was not about citizens, it was about control. But why did Moscow have to become the anti-Western city, and what was lost in the process? Before the revolution, Moscow was a city of tangled lanes and wooden houses, a place where the past pressed in from every corner. The streets twisted around each other, narrow and unpredictable, sometimes barely wide enough for a cart and a pedestrian to pass. Whole neighbourhoods were built from timber, their walls leaning and patched, with smoke curling from crooked chimneys. Fires swept through these districts again and again, leaving scars that shaped the city's uneven growth. Above the rooftops, the skyline broke into a forest of onion domes and bell towers. Orthodox churches, hundreds of them, rose from courtyards and crossroads, their gold and green cupolas catching the sun. Each parish marked its own patch of the city, creating a mosaic of sacred spaces. The air carried the sound of bells, layered over the thrum of markets and the clatter of wagons loaded with grain, furs and firewood. Moscow's heart was the Kremlin, its red walls anchoring a city that sprawled outward in rings. The oldest ring, the boulevard, traced the line of a vanished fortress. Beyond that, the garden ring marked the edge of the old city. But even here, the pattern was improvisational, a patchwork of alleys, wooden yards, and small brick mansions. Maps from the late 19th century show a city with few straight lines, where the shortest route was almost never possible, and where neighbourhoods blurred into each other without clear boundaries. Unlike St. Petersburg, which Peter the Great had laid out as a European showcase, Moscow grew by habit and necessity. It was the engine of Russian commerce, crowded with merchants, labourers and craftsmen. The city's population boomed in the late imperial years, pushing the poor into hastily built tenements and the wealthy into walled estates. Overcrowding was severe, and housing shortages were already a crisis by the early 1900s. Beneath the surface, reformers and engineers debated how to fix what they saw as chaos. Some dreamed of garden cities and new parkways, but the old city resisted change. For the Bolsheviks, who would soon inherit this medieval labyrinth, the city's tangled form was more than a technical challenge. It was a symbol of the old order they intended to erase. On July 10, 1935, the Soviet government signed a decree that would erase centuries of Moscow's past in a single stroke. The general plan for the reconstruction of Moscow was not just a set of blueprints, it was a declaration of war on the city's old identity. Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's trusted lieutenant and the man tasked with carrying out the plan, called it an offensive against the old Moscow. Under his direction, city planners and party officials mapped out a new capital, one that would embody the triumph of socialism rather than the chaos of the past. The plan's ambitions were spelled out in numbers and diagrams. Moscow's boundaries would more than double, swallowing fields and villages. The core of the city would be redrawn with monumental avenues and vast squares, each designed to showcase the might of the Soviet state. Streets like Gorky, now Tverskaya, were earmarked to expand from barely 18 metres wide to over 60 metres, demanding the demolition of entire blocks. The garden ring, once a leafy boulevard, would be straightened and widened, its gentle curves replaced by sweeping axes fit for parades and military columns. But the most visible casualties were Moscow's churches. Over 400 religious buildings, cathedrals, parish churches, chapels and monasteries were torn down in the years that followed. Their domes and bell towers, once the city's defining skyline, vanished behind clouds of dust and the crash of falling masonry. The Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, the largest Orthodox church in Russia, was singled out for destruction. In December 1931, After its icons and treasures were stripped away, explosives reduced the cathedral to rubble. The site was cleared to make way for the Palace of Soviets, a structure planned to rise higher than any church, crowned by a colossal statue of Lenin. The blast was captured in newsreels, a symbol of the regime's determination to replace faith with ideology and history with spectacle. Kaganovich's commission worked with speed and authority. Demolition orders were passed down from the top, enforced by police and municipal trusts. Residents were evicted, neighbourhoods erased, and centuries-old streets disappeared in weeks. Official documents cited technical arguments, fire safety, traffic flow, and sanitation. But the real motivation was always visible. The city would be remade to serve as the capital of the victorious proletariat and as a model for the entire socialist world. The state's power was not just written into law, it was built, stone by stone, into the very fabric of Moscow. The reconstruction was an exercise in control, an architectural program that folded governance into geometry, and that remade the city to make power visible and permanent. Moscow's surface was rewritten to serve a new order, and the evidence is everywhere in its geometry and scale. The city's arteries radiate from the Kremlin like spokes from a hub, each one widened and straightened to serve not just traffic, but spectacle. Tverskaya Street, once a narrow merchant road, was expanded to nearly 60 metres, wider than the Champs-Élysées, wider than Fifth Avenue. The Garden Ring, which had curled gently around the old city, was forced into a bold sweeping belt, its width and curvature dictated by the needs of parades and military columns. These were not streets for strolling or shopping, they were corridors of power, designed to funnel attention and movement toward the city's centre. The new avenues demanded buildings that could stand up to their scale. Along these axes, Stalinist architecture rose in slabs and towers, each one massive enough to dominate the widened streetscape. The most ambitious of these are the Seven Sisters, skyscrapers built between 1947 and 1957, each a hybrid of American verticality and fortress-like monumentality. Moscow State University, perched on Sparrow Hills, sprawls across 1.6 million square metres. Its spire alone reaches over 240 metres, crowning a structure meant to be visible from every corner of the capital. The other sisters, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Hotel Ukraina, the Kotelnicheskaya Embankment Tower, and their siblings repeat the same formula: Gothic spires, tiered facades, and a scale that dwarfs the passerby. In Western cities, the tallest buildings cluster in commercial grids, each one vying for skyline attention. In Moscow, the Seven Sisters are set apart, isolated on their own pedestals, visible from the radial arteries that slice through the city. The intention was not just to impress, but to overwhelm, to make the individual feel small and the state eternal. The city's massing from street widths to tower heights encodes a hierarchy where power is always at the centre, and everything else orbits in its shadow. Beneath Moscow's monumental avenues, another world unfolds, one built not for commerce or convenience, but for spectacle and survival. The Moscow Metro opened its first line in 1935, and from the start, it was never just a way to get across town. Its stations were conceived as palaces for the people, with marble walls, vaulted ceilings, and chandeliers that glitter above the daily rush. Mosaics depict industrial triumphs and revolutionary heroes, turning the act of commuting into a lesson in ideology. Where Western subways focus on efficiency and bare platforms, Moscow's system is a stage set for the state. Stations such as Komsomolskaya and Mayakovskaya are adorned with socialist realist art, marble columns, and intricate tilework. The message is clear, even underground. The Soviet project is grand, orderly, and permanent. The grandeur also has a hidden function. Many of Moscow's central stations plunge deep below the surface, some nearly 74 metres down. That depth is not only a feat of engineering, it is a shield. During World War II, thousands took shelter here from German bombs. In the decades that followed, the Cold War gave the metro a second role. Technical manuals and declassified documents confirm that stations were engineered as civil defence shelters, with reinforced vaults, steel blast doors and sealed airlocks. Some platforms could be closed off completely, equipped with filtered ventilation and emergency supplies, ready to house civilians or officials for days during a nuclear attack. The metro's daily ridership now rivals that of London and Paris combined, but its scale and ambition remain unmatched. It is a network built to impress, to protect, and to remind every traveller that even the journey underground is part of a larger story, one where the state's power extends from the surface to the deepest tunnels below. By the mid-1950s, Moscow's planners faced a new crisis. Millions of people needed homes, and the city's grand Stalinist buildings were too slow and too expensive to provide them. Nikita Khrushchev, who had lived through the hardships of communal apartments and barracks, pushed for a radical solution. The answer arrived in the form of the Khrushchevka, 5-storey apartment blocks assembled from prefabricated concrete panels. These buildings could be put up in weeks, not years. Their design was stripped of ornament, with thin walls, tiny kitchens and no elevators. Comfort was basic, but for many it meant the first private apartment they had ever known. The new housing was not just about speed, it was part of a larger plan to recreate daily life. The micro-rayon, also called micro-district, became the basic unit of Soviet urbanism. Each micro-rayon was designed to house 8,000 to 12,000 residents, enough for a small town, grouped in clusters of identical blocks. Schools, clinics, grocery stores and playgrounds were all set within walking distance, separated from main roads by green strips and courtyards. The logic was mathematical. Planners calculated how many shops, hospital beds and classrooms each cluster needed, then placed them into the plan like pieces on a board. What set this approach apart from Western cities was its uniformity and control. In Tokyo, mixed-use neighbourhoods grew out of local needs and private initiative. In Moscow, every micro-rayon followed the same blueprint, dictated by state norms. The result was a landscape of repetition, row after row of identical blocks, each one a copy of the last. For the first time, most Muscovites had access to private bathrooms and kitchens, but the price was monotony. These new districts stretched for miles beyond the old city, creating a cityscape where daily life was organised not by chance or commerce, but by the logic of the plan. A walk through a Moscow micro-rayon is nothing like strolling the streets of Paris, London or New York. Here, the ground floors of apartment blocks are almost always blank, just doors, mailboxes and stairwells. Shops and services, when they appear, are tucked away inside the superblock or clustered in separate pavilions, not lining the sidewalk. The logic comes from Soviet planning norms. Every resident was supposed to have a grocery store, clinic and school within a short walk, but there was no reason to put them on the main street. Planners calculated how many shops a neighbourhood needed, then placed them at precise intervals, hidden from view to keep the traffic corridors clear and efficient. The result is a city where the street is a space for movement, not for lingering. Cafes and bars are rare, even at intersections where Western cities would be most lively. Wide roads and setbacks make the walk between buildings feel exposed and impersonal. Residents recall childhood spent in courtyards and playgrounds behind the buildings, while the boulevard outside remained a place to hurry through, not to gather. One long-term Muscovite describes it simply. You leave your building, you walk across the grass, and you are already at the bus stop. The shop is somewhere behind, in a little pavilion. The street itself, it is just for cars. This pattern was not accidental. It was embedded in the city's design, prioritising function and control over the unpredictable rhythms of street life. Even today, as new cafes and boutiques try to fill the gaps, the bones of the city still shape how people move, meet, and spend their days. After the Soviet collapse, Moscow became a showcase for contradictions. New money poured in through privatization and foreign investment, fueling a construction boom that overlaid the city's socialist skeleton with layers of glass, steel and neon. The skyline shifted rapidly as office towers rose in the shadows of Stalinist spires, and shopping malls and luxury apartments appeared where factories and ministries once stood. Nowhere is this more obvious than around the rebuilt Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, finished in the late 1990s. Where Stalin's regime had dynamited the original to make way for the Palace of Soviets, Mayor Yuri Luzhkov made the cathedral's resurrection his signature project. Blend nostalgia with spectacle. Luzhkov, who led the city from 1992 to 2010, presided over a period of relentless redevelopment. His administration handed prime sites to favoured developers, often at the expense of historic buildings. The result is a cityscape where mirrored towers reflect onion domes, and high-end boutiques share blocks with Soviet-era housing. By the 2000s, Moscow's urban fabric had become a palimpsest. Each era layered awkwardly over the last, with little regard for continuity. The built environment became a visual argument between market spectacle and the lingering logic of centralised planning, each side refusing to yield to the other. At the centre of Moscow stands the Kremlin, a fortress that is more than a historic landmark. It is the city's gravitational force. Every ring road, every radial avenue, every flow of people and power bends toward its red walls. 14 million residents live in a city that orbits this core, their daily movements organised by a geometry designed to reinforce hierarchy. Unlike the open lawns of the White House or Buckingham Palace, the Kremlin remains walled, guarded and largely inaccessible, its silhouette signalling both authority and distance. In Western capitals, civic centres invite approach. In Moscow, the seat of power is protected at the literal and symbolic heart of the city. This spatial order did not arise by chance. The city's form encodes a deliberate choice to centralise control, to project strength, and to subordinate the individual to the collective spectacle of the state. The gains are impossible to ignore. A metro system that moves millions. Vast parks and forests within city limits. Basic shelter for nearly all. Yet the costs are written into the urban fabric. The loss of historic neighbourhoods. The suppression of spontaneous street life. The enduring sense of separation between citizen and centre. Moscow functions at a scale few cities can match, but its design asks a question that still lingers. Was this city built for its people, or for the power that resides within its walls? Today, Moscow's architecture still enforces distance between citizen and state, a city where scale asserts control, not comfort. As Western cities debate walkability and civic life, Moscow stands as a living reminder. Urban form can shape society as much as society shapes it. The city's grandeur endures, but the question of who truly belongs within it remains unresolved. What kind of city do we want to build next?